Hey everyone, this is Nate from Geezer Skate, and in this video, doing something a little bit different. We've got a book review, not just any book. The Secret History of the Ollie. The Ollie, everyone knows Alan Gelfand invented that, right? Why the heck do you need a book this thick? And let me tell you, this thing is massive. It's only in hardcover, so it's quite heavy. So why the heck do you need a book this big to tell how Alan Gelfand came up with the Ollie? At over 800 pages, well, 900 pages if you count all the appendices and footnotes in this thing, that's a lot of pages talking about the Ollie. It's a heck of a lot more than just the Ollie, as I've found out. It is pretty much the entire history of skateboarding up until the Ollie came around, and then how everything changed after the Ollie. It's written by Craig B. Snyder. He has done an amazing job. This thing is like a doctoral thesis on skateboarding's history. It's incredible. There are facts, figures, names that have been lost to history, all kinds of photos that haven't been seen probably since they were originally taken. I mean, this is an incredible amount of information. And not only that, but it's a fun read. I mean, this is just absolutely fascinating. If you have any interest in the history of skateboarding, I highly recommend checking out this book. Alan Gelfand invented the Ollie, right? I mean, it's as simple as that, you know? I mean, what the heck else can you say about it? Turns out that the Ollie had a pretty long evolution to get to the point where we know it today. In fact, it had a few different names beforehand, and it was, done in slightly different ways that were just different enough to make them different tricks. And so there was the Ollie Pop that came out beforehand. There was the intentionally high or insanely high Ollie Pop, otherwise known as the IHOP, and there was all manner of other tricks that were done beforehand, lifting the board off of the ground, sometimes with your hands and sometimes with your feet, known as a gorilla grip. That was one of the craziest things. I'd never seen or heard of this before I was reading about this in the book. And this is where you would skate barefoot. Your leading foot, your toes would curl around the front edge of your board, and then your back foot, your toes would curl around the tail of the board. And then you would just squat down, hoist yourself up, and just, bring your legs up, and that's how you would get air. That way, utilizing the gorilla grip technique. Turns out the gorilla grip technique, it sounds insanely hard to do, but it's also really hard on your body. In fact, those who practiced it, for a long time actually wound up having hip and pelvic problems later in life due to the motion and the stress that it put on that part of the body. While a cool sounding thing, I don't recommend you going out and trying that, or if you do, maybe, only do it a couple of times. I don't think it's worth, damaging your body permanently, just to say you can do a really old school trick. Yeah, this book is super fascinating because, one, growing up in landlocked East Texas, skateboarding, to us seemed like something that came out of California. And while, for the most part it did originate in California, this book makes it very clear that Florida and its skateboarding community had just as much of an impact, if not a greater impact, on the world of skateboarding as a whole. In fact, you might even say it potentially had a greater impact because, well, that's where the Ollie was invented. Besides Alan Gelfand, there was a number of incredible skaters that came out of the Florida scene. Some well-known, such as Mike McGill, and those who have been lost to history, such as Rick Furness and Jeff Durer. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. Durer? I mean, that's how it sounds in my head. Yeah, it's just incredible, the amount of talent that came out of Florida. Growing up, I, would hear these names, Alan Gelfand and Mike McGill and others, and I just assumed they all came out of California because it seemed like all the pros came out of California for the most part, other than the Texas crew, Jeff Phillips, Craig Johnson, John Gibson, etc. But other than that, it seemed like all the pros were from California. Well, this book makes very clear that Florida's scene was vibrant, important, and deserves as much respect as the California crew gets. That is one thing I think Craig does very well in this book, is kind of really setting the record straight as to, you know, lost areas of skate history, really shining a light on those skate cultures that might have been overlooked, especially by the skate press of the day. Back in the 70s and early 80s, pretty much all skateboarding publications were based in California. So they covered California heavily. For the most part, you know, even when there would be major contests out in Florida, you know, skate press at the time like Skateboarder and Skateboard would feature California pros skating at those contests, even if they were not the actual winners at those contests. You know, they would get full page and multi-page, you know, coverage in the magazines, whereas, you know, the Floridas might get, you know, like a tiny picture in the magazine if they were, you know, or maybe even just a mention in text when they would say, you know, talk about the standings. So besides all of the great information about skate history and skateboarders, and all these amazing individuals that, you know, created the scene that we know and love, there's also in-depth analysis on the history of skate parks and how they came to be. It's incredible. Like, I didn't realize just how many skate parks there were throughout the country in the 1970s. It seemed like every major city had at least one, if not multiple, skate parks in the 70s. And when the skateboarding bust happened in the early 80s, they were pretty much all torn down, which is such a shame. You know, a couple in California and Florida have survived to this day. In fact, you know, one of my dream skate trips is to go out to Florida to Kona, which now is, I believe, the oldest operating skate park in the country. But it's really cool that, you know, he focuses, Craig Snyder focuses on all of these parks, you know, showing, you know, how they evolved from, you know, the very simple, you know, concrete with terrible concrete that was, you know, laid out by people who didn't know how to skate and was not in any way conducive to really learning how to skate. Most skate parks, you know, during that time period were built with, you know, multiple snake runs, ditches, and bowls, and, you know, that's like my favorite skate terrain right there. So, you know, it just makes me want to get a time machine and go back then and, you know, skate all these parks. And I'm psyched that, you know, a lot of modern parks now that are being built currently are starting to, you know, go back to those features. So another thing that Snyder really goes in depth on in here is all of this, you know, companies that, you know, formed in skateboarding. Tom Sims coming up with Sims, Little Skateboards, all of these great obscure, you know, brands that, you know, came out and, you know, rode that wave of skateboarding in the 70s, late 70s, on up into, you know, 1980, 81, and then, you know, been lost to history. So many, you know, really cool things, and just, you know, how skateboards themselves evolved, and, you know, from basically just a flat piece of wood to having a little bit of kicktail on up to, you know, obviously what we know today with the double popsicle shape. Truly amazing, you know, that anybody even learned how to do an ollie on those old boards. You know, I mean, the kicktail on those things was barely, you know, I mean, it was just slight kick. It was hardly anything at all. That's what they, you know, learned how to do the ollie on. I've got to give mad respect, mad props to anybody who learned how to do that. You know, that's, you know, the more amazing thing is that the ollie was born on vert. It wasn't born on flat ground. It was later taken to flat ground. Rodney Mullen is credited for that, but it was before Rodney Mullen, and you know, this book makes clear as to who, you know, came up with the flat ground ollie initially. Rodney Mullen, also a Florida skater. If it wasn't for Florida, we wouldn't have, I mean, eventually California might have come up with all of this. I assume they probably would have. Florida did it first, and so Florida gets the credit for, you know, the ollie and all of these incredible skaters and all of this, you know, innovation that we now know of skateboarding. Like I said, this book is super detailed, super in-depth, and I would love to see a documentary featuring all of the people involved in this. I think it would be awesome. An amazing documentary. It'd probably have to be a mini-series, actually, because there's just so much information. I think you could do like a 5 to 10 part documentary and have a really well done piece on this history. Thankfully, Craig Snyder put together this book to preserve the legacy of skateboarding and its vibrant history. Highly recommend you check this book out. It is an incredible journey. I'm not going to spoil this for you. Alan Gelfand did not invent the ollie. but Alan Gelfand brought the Ollie to the masses. And that is one thing that Snyder makes really clear in this book, is that if it wasn't for Alan, the Ollie may have just remained where it was, a little secret that, the rest of the world did not get to experience. But once Alan brought it to California and showed it off to the pros out there, it just went everywhere. Now, of course, you have to remember, back then, there wasn't, the internet, so people learned about the Ollie through magazines or word of mouth or seeing it in person. And if you didn't have the luxury of a skate contest being held near you, then of course, the next best thing at that time was magazine coverage. And thankfully, there was a how-to coverage on the Ollie back in I think it was 78 or early 79, it might have been 79. In Skateboarder magazine, they had how to do an Ollie. But of course, if for anybody who's ever looked at, this trick tips in Thrasher, from back in the day, or, Skateboarder or wherever, seeing those in a magazine in a sequence shot versus seeing that live or in person or on video is a very different thing. And then, having someone really, with you, kind of helping you learn how to do that yourself. You can thank Alan Gelfand for being an advocate for the Ollie around the world. He did get to go around the world showing it off and planting seeds wherever he went. It's hard to think in this day and age that there was ever a time without an Ollie. I mean, the Ollie is basically the foundation of all modern skateboarding. Skateboarding looked so different before the Ollie. Pre-Ollie, most skateboarding was done by surfers who were just trying to keep up their surf skills on days when the waves were not good. And so they, would roll around on concrete, and they would try to find, things like ditches and banks and things like that where they could practice their surf move. Especially early, Dogtown, Stacy Peralta, Jay Adams, Tony Alva, and all those guys, Larry Bertelman, all of their style was very surf influenced, until things like Alan Gelfand, he was not a surfer at all, so what he did on a skateboard was purely derived from skateboarding. It was for skateboarding. It was not from surfing. It was not for surfing. The crazy thing is, though, once the Ollie did come into being, people started doing that on surfboards, on waves, and also snowboarding, because snowboarding started to rise in the 70s as well. In fact, Sims transferred out of the skateboard industry and into the snowboard market, where you can still find them today, which is really cool that they made that successful transition at that point. And another thing I really like about this book is, besides the people and products that are featured in here, it really, skate parks and even ramps themselves become stars of skateboarding's history. And it's really cool to see, like the Hollywood ramp in Florida, or the pinball ramp, which became the clown ramp. For those of you who are familiar with, Texas skateboarding history, the clown ramp played a pivotal role with Zorlak in the Shut Up and Skate series, and, things like that. And you can even see a video that we have showcasing the rise of the clown ramp when it came back a few years ago. Yeah, I love, that this book really goes in depth in all of this. And it's also cool that it shows all of the, the evolution. It goes from clay wheels into urethane wheels, and just what a radical change that made to skateboarding. Now you could go faster and further on a skateboard. You could skate over more terrain than ever before. You could skate on rough, you could skate on smooth surfaces. The advent of wider boards, of the kicktail, of, just the start of concave. Just those little changes, just how drastically they changed the trajectory of skateboarding. And it really goes in depth of all the different people, such as Frank Nasworthy of Cadillac Wheels, and showcasing how these people played such an important role of getting us to the place where we are today. I highly recommend you checking this out. Even if you think you know what skateboarding's history looks like, you probably don't know it as well as you think you do. I had no idea how many holes were in my knowledge bank about skateboarding till I read this book here. If you're a student of skateboarding, just have any passive interest in it, I highly recommend checking this book out. You'll be glad you did. Appreciate you all watching this video about the history of skateboarding. Hope you learned some things today, and while you're at it, why don't you check out this next video coming up about old school skating, skateboarding history, and old people having fun. Till next time, keep skating, stop aging.